I think
before.
we've got a decent amount of people here, so we can basically start. Like I mentioned, while we do the intros, we'll let everybody else join. Uh, uh, Today, we're going to talk about basically a very interesting topic. The title of the webinar is Show Me the ROI, Turning API Governance into Profits. My favorite topic, and I think everybody's favorite topic, but all jokes aside, I think this is something that is going to be really, really important going into 2026 and beyond because we talk to a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, a lot of people who want to do this but not necessarily don't necessarily understand how to explain this to management, to leadership, and what the kind of why is it so crucial for the future of, I would say, any enterprise company going into 2026 and beyond. So I have two really great people here that are to talk this about. So before we dive into the intros, we are going to cover the following. First, we're going to try to figure out what API governance is because I feel like every company, every person that I talk to has their own definition. So let's maybe try to agree on one of these. How is AI impacting API governance? I think we will be mentioning AI probably in 2026 until it becomes the standard, but I do think that it is driving a lot of the need for API governance, and we're going to talk about that. We are going to address the kind of elephant in the room, and then what is the ROI on API governance and why you should why you should basically kind of try to understand the ROI and how to get to it. We're going to actually talk about how you can go from policies, which is usually what people associate with API governance. It's boring. It's a bunch of policies. I hate it. As soon as you mention the word governance, everybody goes crazy. How do we turn that into KPIs and profit? And how do you measure ROI across your API ecosystem? And finally, the business translator tool. It is something that Mark has been working on and kind of for a while, and I think it's really cool. And we're also going to implement some of his logic into our product because I think it's that good. He's going to show you what that is all about and how you can actually calculate some of these things. Now, let's start. I don't want to start with myself. Mark, go ahead first, and then we'll go to Harsha, and then I'll do it.
Hey everyone, so I'm Mark Boyd. I'm the director at Platformable. We support the development of open digital ecosystems. So a lot of that means that we've helped organizations sort out their governance, whether that's API governance, data governance, now AI governance. We're sort of reframing it or bringing it all together as context first governance. I'm happy to talk about that another time. But we see governance as being the operational fabric that makes ecosystems possible. So because it's the trustworthy layer, like it's the thing that's going to give you trust internally and externally with your partners and customers. So yes, we'll talk about how to get that right over the next 40 minutes or so.
Thank you, Mark. I've known Mark throughout the years. He's never, he's, I almost said he's never been helpful. He's always been nothing but helpful, and very somebody who's, we co-written the governance report last year for API Days with him. Amazing work. So I'm really glad to have you. Thank you for joining us. Harsha.
We'll put that on chat as well for you folks to check out that report. Yeah, I'll go next. I'll keep it simple. Harsha here from the Treblle team. My job here at Treblle is to work with our customers, which means my work mostly involves helping organizations from companies with a few thousand employees to some of the largest global enterprises, help them figure out APIs, both strategically as with their business goals, as well as technically when it comes to tooling and beyond. So when we planned this session, the reason I was genuinely excited about this topic is because API governance, from my conversations, has been moving from being a very boring architectural topic of just discussing to becoming much more of a business discussion. So we'll talk more about it today.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Vedran. I'm the CEO of Treblle. I like to jokingly say that I'm a backup engineer at Treblle as well. I did spend the last last week tweaking some of our infrastructure with the engineering team. Really enjoyed it. Allowed me to step back from the day-to-day API governance things and do some hands-on work and it's always it's great the vibe code stuff, but it's always cool when you can actually build some nice stuff. Anyhow, I have an engineering background, really like that stuff, but I've been spending the last 4 years with Treblle, basically working with really large organizations across the world, trying to help them understand their API ecosystem, and basically try to help them make more money out of their APIs, if you will. Now, let's move on to the first slide or first conversation point of the day is what actually is API governance. Now, I did kind of lay out three talking points, which I'll cover, but just like always, I think will be more than fine to solo. I think a lot of people, talk about a lot of different things in every different organization. Like they mean everything from scoring APIs, like you see on the right side, like giving it some kind of a score. They refer to it as a bunch of policies that prevent their developers from being faster. They also basically talk about discovery and knowing what it is and how it works. I think it's all of that and more. But basically, the three things that we want to highlight, and then we can dive deeper, is good API governance means actually fewer incidents in production, faster onboarding of your developers and partner developers, and at the end of the day, a happier ecosystem of anybody who's using APIs. And basically, it connects business goals to API design, meaning everything that you do on an API is somehow translated to some kind of a business outcome. And the third, it turns your API kind of landscape from a liability into a competitive advantage. And we can maybe expand on each of those or talk about some of these. Harsha, what would you add or say about this?
From conversations that I've been having with our customers and enterprises, I think Mark's framework probably talks about this much more in detail that you'll all like, I'm sure. But I think it very much depends on organizational context in terms of how your organization is structured. How does that, is it much more centralized or federated? And I think a lot of it depends on a lot of the governance depends on your organizational structure and the people that actually run the business as opposed to more operational things. For example, I was speaking to a bank recently, and on call we started asking people who owns the identity API. I rarely got one single answer. Everyone believes they own that piece, but there was no dedicated technical owner or a business owner for that API. And I think solving for governance means ultimately having some ownership with someone, so it can be given the importance that it needs.
Mark, what do
I
you say?
love that, Harsha. Yeah, we'll come back to that, some of that discussion around the organizational context. I think it's one of those missing pieces when we talk about governance. I love what's here. I do love this thing of competitive advantage. I think we do need to keep reframing it like that. We've been talking about governance as being acceleration and scalability, so it's rather than, because governance is such a dirty word, so we call it API acceleration, a digital scalability, digital acceleration. And then also the first point gets to some of the real benefits of governance. We see it as policies and processes that let you harness the full value of your APIs. And so which means fewer incidents, faster onboarding, happier developers, so yeah. To us, it's about like getting the full value out of your APIs. That's what governance is. Yeah.
I think every time we spoke to engineers, they're like, "Oh, governance. Oh, well, I have to do a lot of stuff. Oh, it's this like policies."
Bureaucratic, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Bottleneck.
bureaucracy. But actually, what we've seen and what some of the research that I read upon and some of the data that we have, basically when it comes to engineering onboarding, if there is proper API governance, engineers generally onboard about 40% faster if they know basically, hey, here's the rule, here are our rules, and you can abide by the rules, and whatever API you're about to work in, this is how that works. This is these are the required criteria. This is what you need to build. You can expect this from every API. It's just much faster, produces a lot more errors. So nobody wants to wake up at 3 a.m. and go respond to an incident. And that's where these things should not be possible with the proper API governance in place. And usually it's been tied to like these very complex processes. And I think this was mainly a tooling issue. And I think that I hope we've solved it. We constantly at Treblle obsess and work on our governance tooling, but I think it's largely been archaic tools that try to fit, processes that needed to be, maybe like Mark said, reframed and modernized itself, and the tooling just wasn't there. So I think with the proper tool, it becomes less of a hassle, more of a good thing. So with that being said, let's talk about the big guy in the room, which is AI. And I think one of the kind of interesting things that we've been seeing, especially in very large organizations with very large portfolios, is, you know, I've been saying this in the entire last year. I don't know any single really large enterprise organization that has fully adopted AI in production, and nobody believed me. But now there are reports about it, so people now believe that. But all in all, I think the number one problem that we hear is obviously trust, not just for the AI, but actually what's the state of all of those APIs, because the only way that you can actually enable your entire organization to get access to data is through APIs. And basically now people are trying to figure out, well, if before we do this, we have to clean house and we have to make sure everything is in order. So what do you think, Harsha and Mark, is happening in these orgs? Are they finally realizing the value of APIs and governance at the same time, or?
They definitely are realizing value. I think developers call APIs intentionally. I think AI is pretty much continuous. They keep retrying. It's all automatically chain requests across services or multiple services, and there's no human pacing involved here. So I think that's where I think the traffic or the volume surge happens, which is probably not counted for or accounted for. So yeah, that's to start with. That's when it becomes mission critical for infrastructure, because that's not if it is not accounted for.
I wonder, Harsha, if some of the issue, it might be some a little bit of bias of like who you're talking to in this regard, because the ones you're talking to recognize the issue and want to hear from you about how to help them solve it. Because some of the people I'm talking to, they don't want to invest in API governance, but they want to go full throttle on AI.
Mm.
And so they missed that whole let's get our foundations in order because that's the bedrock that we can build the AI
Do,
on,
do you think they just don't know about the API piece, or they don't care, or they
I
think
think
it's like, oh, it's something my engineering team will solve?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. I think there is a little bit, it comes back to that whole bureaucratic thing of like, ugh, I remember back in the days when APIs were first, and we were thinking of new use cases for APIs. And one of them we presented to a bank required all of them to look at their leasing data and blah, blah, blah. And they were like, we would have to clean up our leasing data first. And so it was like, ugh. And they didn't bother going ahead with that API use case because they didn't want to do the work of cleaning their but I think so. There is a little bit of that with APIs of like, oh, do we have to really clean it up? Can't we just play with this new technology? But I think there is at the same time, I think there is this industry, oh, it's, more than industry, it's like across a number of industries, this trend towards we've got to do API modernization now, because we need our APIs not to have the duct tape pulled together bits that were good for that were fine for how we were doing them. We now need them to be, production grade and scalable so that we can start using AI more across our internal applications, like get rid of our old internal applications and just spin up as needed applications or workflows or agents internally to do things using our APIs and our data sets and then get rid of them when we don't need them. So there's a move towards that. And then there's also this recognition that our APIs need to speak to agents and therefore need to be discoverable. So they need to have the error messaging, the standardization, the good design
Exactly.
practices.
I think to add something that we've been doing internally, we've been doing a lot of research into how well do all of these AI LLMs and AI agents understand Open API specification, which is kind of the bedrock of every API.
Mhm.
And basically, what we've kind of learned are two things, and we did develop some software around it. Number one, of course, the cleaner and better your Open API spec is, and the more standards you follow, which comes back to governance,
Yeah.
the easier it is for LLMs and AI agents to understand that. Secondly, we've actually seen that in a lot of cases, the open API specs, there isn't like a middle when it comes to the state of open API specs. It's either very, very good, and I would say sometimes even bloated, or it's very, very bad. There isn't like a middle layer of open API specs that are just good. And we've kind of seen that the Open API spec format itself is a bit too much when it comes to on large APIs, let's say above 50 endpoints. And we actually created tooling that compresses Open API specs for specifically for these AI agent use
Right.
cases. And even better yet, we've learned that developing, believe it or not, CLI tools that can't ping the API are a much more better way, a better resource to kind of onboard AI onto your APIs. But we're going to talk about that maybe later. All in all, the point I was trying to make is everything that is happening in all of these orgs is happening through thousands of APIs. And yes, I think that this year is going to be the year of agents. And I think, unfortunately, everybody's going to have to do we have to do it, like Mark says,
Yeah.
unless they're going to be
But the
in big
good thing
trouble.
is, you can actually use some AI to do that bit.
Yeah.
Like, in fact, one of the areas there's an AI use case for is if you find someone going, ugh, then it's like, great, that says tedium. It says it's tedious. Let's get AI to do it instead of us,
I
And so
agree.
go
I
after
agree.
those ones. Yeah.
I agree.
That or maybe we just that or maybe we just change the name and not call it governance.
Yeah.
Call,
Yeah.
call it something else.
I have a very good acronym that I came up with just for this presentation. So let's see how I do. Uh, uh, but let's talk about why, besides the effect that people have when they're talking about governance, I think another aspect that we've been kind of uh, dealing with, to be perfectly honest, in every org that we do, that we kind of work with is the ROI situation. I think most leadership teams at a high level do not basically have a full understanding of what the ROI on a governance program is in their company. I think a lot of customers, and we've seen this started to happen in 2025 at the beginning, there is, I think throughout the 5 years that we've been doing this, 2025 was probably the most amount of interest in API governance programs, and that has continued to 2026. And it's a good thing. But basically, I think most teams still measure, I think it's all about what you measure. And Mark, probably you're going to be able to talk about more than we do. I think teams that usually deal with APIs are very engineering heavy and focused. And they're always interested in metrics like, what's my uptime look like? What's my latency? Great. But again, nobody actually measures the cost of stuff being slow. They all just want to make it fast. But what is that cost of being slow, and what is that cost of going down? What is the cost of you having to provide hours upon hours of engineering support and customer support when you're onboarding somebody onto your partner API? So again, I want to say that the ROI is already happening. It's just showing up as a loss and not gains in your at the end of every quarter or the fiscal year. So maybe Mark, you take us through what you've seen and why you think there is an ROI problem, or maybe it's just optical illusion.
Yeah, no, is this where I jump to my slides? Or not yet? No, not yet. But yeah, so then in the discussions I have, I think over the last year or so, I think API governance started to speak more like you were saying in 2025. It became like API sprawl. We're going to solve API sprawl was, one of the issues,
Yep, I agree.
which really meant governance.
Discovery and sprawl. Yes.
Yeah. And then we got back to, okay, technically solve it. And so then it was like a little bit like observability dashboards, but for your API portfolio. So it was a little bit of things like the uptime, latency, all of those things, plus then things like your top 10 most used APIs, your top 10 customers using your APIs, and those sorts of things. But still, it came back to, so then a business owner looking at that is still not sure what that means from the business side of business side of things, and yeah. So that what we're going to talk about in a minute is about how then to translate these metrics that we've got into ROI dollar values, for each.
I see. I see. Harsha, anything you remember from our calls or negotiations and roadblocks that we face?
I think I know we were putting some notes together just to put down some stats which are pretty much on the lower side. An average enterprises like loses about $100,000 for 1 hour of API downtime. Imagine, I mean, it's not just about downtime. A payment API running at maybe 99.95% uptime can still lose hundreds of thousands of dollars or probably
Yeah.
even millions if latency increases, maybe during peak hours or even in
I mean,
booking. Yeah.
I was going to give you an example. Again, this is public data. You can look it up. JP Morgan moves about $1 trillion a day through APIs. Imagine if that API goes down for 5 minutes. We're talking about billions upon billions of dollars, or if it becomes super slow, all because somebody pushed something that they were not aware of. So there are real kind of like we said, it's all about what you're measuring versus and what your leadership can understand versus metrics that don't speak what you need to.
And something
Now,
that we've also been doing, Vedran, if you remember, maybe someone can put it on chat or I'll put that in a minute, is how support teams, especially as the
Yeah.
number of APIs have like tripled or the API traffic has increased so much in the last 5 years. I think the number of engineering hours that are being spent just to support these APIs and these API consumers, of which most of these consumers are new, either agents or even humans. So these technical success teams or support engineering teams are spending the amount of engineering hours spent is rapidly increasing, which directly again goes back to cost of precious engineering time that's being spent on supporting not so great APIs. So
I
that's also
agree.
something that costs are real, they are just distributed and sometimes invisible because nobody in the support team thinks that having not having a great open API spec directly results in them spending
Yeah,
more time resolving
exactly.
support tickets.
It's very hard to cross connect that across different departments in the org. And when we talk about, I wanted to give you a couple of examples. Again, and Mark is going to have, we got 2 more slides, and then I'll hand it over to Mark when he's going to show you the entire framework. I want to give an example of how basically most people think about policies and how you should kind of go broader than that and connect these policies to actual outcomes. I have a very I have a favorite one, which is about rate limiting. So basically, if you have a governance policy that says, hey, every API has to have rate limiting, uh, uh, you know, because it reduces abuse and protects infrastructure, a KPI that tracks incidents caused by missing rate limits proves that that policy is working. And when you can show that governance reduced incidents by 60% and freed up, let's say, 200 engineering hours, suddenly governance is like the number one priority, right? Because again, you've prevented attacks, you've reduced incidents by 60%, and you've freed up 200 engineering hours just because you implemented one policy where you said, hey, every API has to have rate limiting. And I don't think that should be that should even be a policy. It should just be every gateway should have that by default. But yeah, go ahead, Mark.
And then how many of those rate limited users then pay for a higher subscription level because they want more access to more API calls? So that
Exactly.
revenue is also what you can gain by having the rate limiting in place.
I'll tell a very personal story when we're on this topic. I told you we spent the last week redefining our infrastructure, and we went from an API gateway where we had limited visibility. I don't want to say which one. It's one of the bigger clouds because they all. I don't want to. They all have
Sure.
their challenges, but one of the things that we had problems with, believe it or not, is getting some of the data about rate limits and where they are. And we've talked about this, Mark, and adding this to Treblle. And basically, once we switched our infrastructure and basically were able to track this inside of Treblle, we were actually able to upsell so far 2 customers in just 1 week because exactly
Yeah.
like you said, we saw they were going overboard in real time. We were able to reach out and upsell them. So there's yes, we knew that we needed to have rate limiting by default, but for a lot of organizations, that's unfortunately a policy, which is good. But that's just one example of how you can translate that into measurable hours and measurable for who? Measurable for the CFO, measurable for the CIO, measurable whoever needs to approve the API governance program. That's how you get them to approve, not by saying, hey, we're going to pay a tool X amount of money and then we're going to
Yeah.
have to train our people and they're all going to be pissed and, we're going to have to have offsites to compensate for that, blah, blah, blah. Well, I think it's still worth it.
I
Any
think
of Harsha, you want to add anything?
while all of this is true, I think the hard part in a very large enterprise is about who is going to do this work,
Mm.
right? I think that's where it gets trickier in terms of correlating KPIs with it needs a lot of cross-functional cooperation. Just on your example, Vedran, we are talking about engineering teams, support teams, there's a sales team involved, and probably there's a product manager involved as well. So someone's got to do the job of actually working cross-functionally and then coming up uh, with a final ROI number that can be presented to leadership, which is what we'll probably learn now.
I agree. The last thing that we're going to spend talking about before we give it off to Mark is how you can measure your ROI across your API ecosystem. And I told you guys I have a very cool acronym that every leader, especially the CFO, is going to understand. You know how there's like CapEx, OpEx. Well, I kind of said I coined this APEX thing, which is availability, performance, and experience. So let's if you work in a really large go to your CFO and ask him, hey, can I have 200K for an Apex program that I want to run and let me know how that goes. But basically, it boils down, in my opinion, into 4 sections: availability, performance, experience, and cost. Basically, when we think about one category of measurement, which is availability, when APIs are down, basically that means revenues is stopping, customers leave, and you erode trust faster than any marketing budget can fix. Again, especially if you are in the business of selling API access directly or through your partners. I think there isn't a worst case scenario when your APIs are down, or even just one API is down, and you have other partners that depend on it. I think Harsha mentioned one very API heavy category, which is travel and banking. I think basically if an API goes down in that category, they're losing 500K to 2 million annually just by having, an hour downtime a quarter, believe it or not. Performance isn't about, hey, my API is slow, my endpoint is slow, right? It's not like, hey, is this like P99 latency, P50 latency? It's about being frustrating to the engineers that are trying to basically integrate these APIs, because at the end of the day, if you want to make money on your API, somebody has to integrate it. Somebody has to basically build on top of that. And slowness, we know it's not even like a myth, literally kills conversion rates. In the world of AI, it kills AI reliability, and you do not get those renewal conversations. They go somewhere else. Finally, experience. If your APIs are complex and hard to integrate, you're paying that basically in onboarding time, support tickets, and churn. We've kind of talked about this, but having a very messy, unstructured, poorly documented API, you will spend, or your engineers will spend most of their times trying to provide customer support, trying to resolve support tickets that are all about people not knowing how to use your thing. And finally, cost. Every ungoverned API carries a hidden tax when it comes to infrastructure rate, incident response, and engineering time. I think basically when you think about teams running ungoverned API portfolios typically over provision infrastructure by 30 to 40% because they don't simply know or have any visibility. So that's a lot of money going to AWS, Azure, and the big guys, which could be going to your org. So that's something that I think, again, I coined Apex. Mark, what do you're the expert on this, and you're going to share us your own tool. So what do you think about the acronym?
I love it. I'm gonna try and steal it
Yeah, go do it,
and merge it
please.
into the calculator workbook. Definitely. It's
Yeah.
great. We could actually on the when I show the metrics that we're using, we could actually group them into those four types of value.
Let's try to do that right
Yeah.
now. So what we're gonna do, Mark has this really nice tool that he calls the business translator tool. And basically it converts API governance metrics into board justifiable language. So he's gonna share his screen. I'm gonna stop and he's gonna take you through it. Okay? Go
Great.
ahead, Mark.
Cool. We're here. And then also, let me just try and move to slideshow view. And also, then Dave's got some great notes that are worth cutting and pasting from the chat. Thanks, Dave. Always great to see you in the rooms. The where he's put some suggestions for some of that value, and we'll talk about that in a sec. The so before we get to the crosswalk and the calculator, just going back to one of Harsha's points earlier. So what we find when we talk about governance is you need to know where you are, who you are, and what you want, what and who you need to convince. So we just jump straight past these. So first of all, what is your organizational context? Because some of the API governance, so saying let's set up an API governance committee, sure, that's going to work in a centralized area, but it's not necessarily going to work in a federated or in a platform and enablement type environment. So you've got to think about what's the right, is that worth putting all of your political capital trying to suggest a linter for the whole organization if it's a federated organization? You're not going to get anywhere because it's not that's not how your organization works.
Where do you think most orgs are? Is it centralized, federated, or platform? I know personally some that I know in every category, but I've never actually kind of wondered what's the most popular one.
Yeah, so we're seeing so in US there I think platform enablement's now sort of being is moving up. So that's taking. London is or UK is still very much between the two, centralized and federated, about 50-50. So and they're oh no, sorry, 40-40 and then 20 say for platform enablement. And then a little bit more on the federated and now starting to go towards platform enablement in Europe. Because I've done my governance, I always ask who's here from, which one corresponds with what you've got, and that seems the split, at
In
least in those who are coming along to API work. So yeah, so I mean, a lot of everyone moved to federate, or a lot of people moved to federated because they wanted to pick up the speed rather than have the bottleneck of centralized. But then that created too much complexity with every team doing their own thing. So then that's where platform enablement tried to sit between as like a new centralized, but not top down centralized, and that sort of coming up as the sort of winning pattern, if you like, thanks to team topologies and the rest. So then once you know that, you can then think about what's your role, and you can see along the top here, there's the types of roles. If you're a CTO, you still need to convince people to use the linter and the style guide, sort of thing. So but you've got some tools like you can embed the KPIs for the whole organization, and so there's different strategies for governance that are open depending on what you need. We're not going to go through this. You can get this in the downloadable resources from today, and then what you do if you're a platform. But I speak to a lot of developers who are really keen on API governance but don't have any sway internally, and they're like, "What can I do?" And so we've found this is what works. And suddenly, when you do some of these things, if that's the level you're at and you're the lone voice, keep hammering away at the little bits that you can do, finding the like-minded people on other teams and that sort of thing, because one day, like Vedran and Harsha have been saying, it'll just flip around, and then suddenly it's a major theme. We must do API modernization and we're committed to governance, and then you're like, told you, and then you've got your stuff already in your back pocket.
I think the most difficult out of all these, for
Yeah.
me at least, seems to be the centralized place, because we are really relying on just the CTO or the head of architect to make those decisions, and just keeping our fingers crossed,
They
saying that
really need to be on board. I know, and they're so busy with so many other major projects that's really
yeah,
tricky for them to champion this. Yeah, you're right.
makes sense.
Okay, cool. So then the next thing to do was your organization structure, your role and who you can influence, but then getting down to, okay, who do you need to influence and what's the value? And this is where Dave's comments will become in handy, where he's got some of the reasoning behind in his comments in the chat, where he sort of explains the value of API governance. And here's some of them. We've broken it down. This is where we could group them by that Apex model that you've got, Vedran, and then show these. So it's important, I think, to know what's important to yourself, because they're the ones you're naturally going to try to lobby and advocate for, but they might not be important to whoever you're speaking to. So here we've got a cheat sheet where you can put down, okay, I've got to speak to the CTO. So as Harsha was saying, well, I know they're interested in relationship management because they've got a KPI around building more integration partners or something like that, or they're worried about faster onboarding, sort of, or the chief revenue officer I've got to get on board and they're interested in faster onboarding or whatever. So you've got this, and we've got 2 pages, and you can keep going with other benefits that you come up with as well. But these are the ones we've found working with people in API governance. And so it gives you an idea of which ones to pitch when you're trying to
This is cool.
advocate
Yeah.
for API governance resources. Then there's now you know the motivations and what you're going to pitch. Then you need the metrics to back you up, and so you can use this kind of sheet to just start jotting down what some of those are. But so this is the work we did with our API governance framework and some of the tooling we've got around that. But now we've taken this, thanks to some of our conversations we had in Paris, Vedran, and then Harsha and I on the phone earlier this year. That's when we've then thought, okay, let's do a crosswalk. And so what we've got here in the purple is the API metrics that we're kind of more used to. So API uptime or latency, as we talked about. So when if you're saying API latency in your technical team, when you're turning and speaking to business, you're saying revenue lost from sales or conversion abandonment. You know,
This is great. Yeah. So it's
when you're
like almost like it's literally a translator. Yeah.
It's literally a translator. Yeah. So a crosswalk in standards is where you've got two standards that are similar, and they're saying how when you speak in one standard, a crosswalk will tell you how it matches with a standard in a data field in another standard. So this is kind of like that's why we call it a crosswalk, because it's like two languages, and this is the bridge between the two. So yeah, so it's got this, and I've put them all here as you could actually change this and have them all as the positives, but I've put them all as the risks, if you like. So when we look at, say, for example, top API users, and we'll look at this in a minute, what that's really going to show you is the stagnant customer usage, or which I actually consider like churn risk as well. It's sort of like those who are just not doing that, who are sitting below the rate limiting and not jump into that next subscription level, sort of thing. But yeah, so this is the ones we've got. And then what we do so we've got the crosswalk that explains that. And then we've got with that a calculator workbook. And Rebecca Vitarazzo from our team is on the call. I think she's joined. Maybe she's jumped off by now, but she's really helped visualize all of this so it really gets the information clearly across. I'm really grateful for that. But let's look at a couple of these, and I'd love your input, Vedran and Harsha, on these. So let's do an easy one first. API uptime or API latency and that revenue lost.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're saying this is how the crosswalk, and the data we've got from this comes mostly from e-commerce sites, but any site that's got a conversion risk or a conversion goal and that you're slowing down is going to have that. So we're looking mostly at the external impacts here. And then also when you're doing these, people are going to fight back on them. So sometimes when you present and say this is lost, people are going to say, where did you get that number from? So you need to have your references and all of that. So we've got the references for all of these. But you might have your own assumptions, or you might do your own research and get your own assumptions. Maybe you're using historical data that you've got from your own revenue and things like that as well. So that might all help here. We're going to do the simple calculation. So it looks complicated, but it's not that bad. So the loss is B times C times 7%. And that's because we've looked at the e-commerce research studies, and they say that every 100 millisecond delay costs 7% of your conversions. So I love that because it's not a flat absolute number of $1,000, because it depends on what your usual sales rate, sales volume is each month. So if your normal sales volume is 10,000, then for every 100 milliseconds, 7% of 10,000 by number of 100 milliseconds is going to be the delay. So here we've got. So what you could do is you go, okay, average API call duration over a month, and I know on Treblle you've got that. You can see that. So say it's 600 milliseconds on average. Well, then that's going to be 6. So you put 6 in here, and then your average monthly revenue for that API, you can hopefully get that figure. And then you multiply those two together, and then by 7%, and that's how much you're potentially losing from low latency. So if you want to spend some money next month on improving latency, make sure it's less than the potential
7%,
loss,
yeah.
and you've got a business case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. It's a nice calculation. We know, based on our anatomy of an API report, that most people have been optimizing latency in 2025. So I think most of them got that budget, but it would be interesting to see where that budget goes this year.
Yeah, right.
I
Okay,
mean,
let's go
we've seen
after
the
it.
latency. Yeah, we've seen the latency drop from, I think, close to 700 milliseconds in 2024 to about half that number, to about 320 or something in 25.
Wow.
So massive
Yep.
reduction in latency. I think that's a result of everything that you told, Mark, because uptime is probably the most important and load time because people check out. I mean, nobody waits for wait or nobody reports this incident, right? They just drop
Yeah.
off.
Yeah.
So
Especially important with AI as well. But yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, no. And then I won't go into this one, but we also have an advanced formula where not only do you calculate that loss, but also there's data that shows for shoppers if a website's too slow, people 79% won't visit it again. So maybe that's too high for developers, but there would be a figure then as far as the percent of developers who will find an alternative. And if half of the anatomies that you're looking at have dropped from 700 millisecond to 350, then the ones who are still at 700 milligrams, they're losing their customers who are going to the ones who are now 350 milliseconds or less. So
I
it's
agree.
double whammy for that one. Okay, let's talk. This is one of my favorites. This is the top API users. So we sort of have been seeing that in the governance. I know Treblle does that and it shows the top API users. When I've done work with API governance teams in banks, enterprise, and this is one of the issues with centralization, Harsha, at the centralized API governance level, they don't know if that's who your most important users are. Like, who are your
mhm.
top 10 as far as the best
Agreed.
partners, the biggest users that the big fish that you've got? So you've got to speak to your line of business and know who those are for starters. And if they're not in your top 10, then they're probably stagnating. So they're using your APIs the way you had originally intended. They're not exploring new API use case opportunities. Their business is like just spinning wheels, so they're not growing their API usage every month. At a faster rate than what you're seeing across the board for customers. So that's a risk as far as you're going to lose them possibly in the future, or they're going, or you're not getting the full partnership value if they're partners, sort of thing. So here, you want to look at making sure your customers are getting the full use of your APIs, and the partners are actually offering your APIs to their customers, and not starting to build with alternative API products. So this one's a little bit more complicated. For this one, we want to have a look at the users and get that list of who is most important users. So what you can do is here on this one, we want to get the list of the most important customers, and ranked in order of importance, for example. Then your list of top 10 users for the past month. You can put that in a spreadsheet, put them in rows, cells B5 or, whatever. And then here's the formula you would use to see how many. So if there's three of your most important customers not listing in your top 10, then your number here is three. So you've got
Yep.
Yeah.
three that are below that. And now what you want to do is look at what was your monthly revenue 2 months ago, your average monthly revenue, multiply that by your monthly growth rate for your API growth, and then that's how much potentially your most important customers are stagnating. And so that sort of shows what you're missing because they're not keeping up with growth
Missed
every
revenue,
month.
yeah.
Yeah. But you can, again, we can do a more complicated, or you can do a more sophisticated one where you tier it. So if you've got five of those partners are like enterprise, high level, three or four are good resellers, but they're moderate, and so on. Again, to fight back against those arguments where people say, this is bullshit, it's too big, or like that's a large number, I don't believe you, then you can then sort of tier them. And so, okay, for enterprise users, the average of enterprise users growth rate per month versus plus the average
Yeah.
for the resellers per month, sort of thing. So you're getting a little bit tighter on how those assumptions are made.
Yep.
Okay. And then final one, API compliance. I love that you've got this as a score in API Insights. It's when we talk about API governance, we recommend using that. There's a great tool from Sectorus as well. That's a AI compliance checker as well that we think is really cool. So here, what you're measuring with compliance risk is the expected loss. So what would you expect to pay if you're non-compliant? So what
Yep.
you do is you take an average of the of what people pay in fines for non-compliance, and you multiply that by your compliance risk. So in this case, we've got this, and we know it's say it's 60% compliance score. Then you subtract that from 100, and so we know that there's a 40% probability risk that you're going to get caught out for non-compliance. And then you multiply that by an average. So we've got a US average from Akamai, say it's 833,000. The Australian averages of the open banking API breaches over three banks was on average 588. So you could do that and then you work out. So if you want to invest in compliance, you can show here's your, we're risking a fine of, whatever 40% of 600,000 is. I'm a words guy, but I don't have my calculator
It's
here.
really interesting how you were able to turn all of these different kind of metrics into something that I think leadership teams and decision makers could potentially understand, and how you can go from technical to these business terms. I think that's really cool. So nice job there, man.
Thanks.
But
I mean, what I love though also is the people I speak to in API governance. They believe in this. They believe in their value and the mission, and they want all of that. But but it's really hard work sometimes in convincing others across the organization. And this lets them be the hero. This lets them actually start showing how what the value that they offer in their workplace and why they're going to be crucial. This is really going to be important for AI because you need these people here to be able to help build the AI.
I agree, especially because some of these, I think you did the right thing in turning this into negatives. I'll tell you why. Because basically, whenever even we give ROI calculations for Treblle, by the way, you can go on our website, click the ROI calculator. We're going to give you a real life ROI calculator, just like you guys, that you can take home. But the point I was trying to make is, a lot of leaders then come back to me and say, "Hey, Vedran, this is great, but these are non-material savings." So, for example, the last one that you showed around risk,
Yeah.
everybody's like, "That's that didn't
Yeah.
happen. We didn't actually save that money."
Yeah.
But if we lose a customer, then that is
Yeah.
actually, we prevented that from happening, because you essentially told us there's a stagnant customer usage, or we're losing revenue literally because our API is slow, or we're slower to market, or some of these other different things.
100% agree. Where the compliance score and the potential fines or the risk expected loss is useful is to have that done so that the minute a bank, if you're in Australia and the minute a bank is fined for non-compliance under the Consumer Data Right Act, then you bring it out to your
Of
bank,
course, of
but
course.
like, and have that ready. Yeah. But other than that, it's like you say, it's useless. Like everyone says that compliance and security is, oh, yes, it's very important. I'm not going to invest in it though.
Yeah, everybody understands P&L. So anything that I think, the reason why I like the your work is because we're already doing a top API consumers
Yeah.
report, top API reports. We already have that data, slowest API, slowest endpoints, governance scores. What we were missing is the negative, right? What does that actually mean for you? And I'm really looking forward to getting some of these things in place.
Yeah.
Do you
Well,
want to show anything else, or should we go to a quick Q&A?
let's go Q&A just on that top API users. When you're saying that, you can actually make it like, imagine if you had a YAML file of your top API users, then you could have in your dashboard immediately showing the ranking of where they are meant to sit, sort of thing. So there is ways of like technically showing this in a dashboard as well.
Cool.
I was getting to that mark actually. So for all of this to actually happen, you first need to know your APIs. So
Right.
once you know your APIs, then you can actually start doing all of these
Very true.
calculations. So I think just understanding what your top APIs are, who your top users are, I think that understanding that visibility is first. Before we
Yeah,
go to
most
Q&A,
stores
one
don't
last
have
question.
that.
Yeah, one question for you, Mark, maybe for our audience, and we get into this pretty often as well. Almost every time an organization starts thinking about this, right? Who should actually own this? Because this sits between many teams we are talking about.
Yeah.
If you go back to your central federated and platform and enablement driven, is there a single persona that should own this metric or build this metric? Because it doesn't seem like if you ask an engineer to go do this research, they're not going to do this because it's not their
Yeah.
job. So
No, absolutely, exactly. So that really great question. I love that. So what we had to do in our API governance framework was, well, two things. One is we've created a RACI matrix. So we've got a RACI matrix for all of these API governance functions and who would then be who we think would be in charge of them. And then you could change that based on your organizational context. But like that's what's needed. And then the other one we do is we've got a framework that's a flow so that it helps eventually with that automation that Vedran was talking about at the start. But also, the whole idea is that there's no point where the accountability falls in the crack in the middle between two tasks, So, but that's because that's what's happening right now. Yeah, everyone's like, "Oh, this is great." No one's. Anyone's like, "Okay, great." We leave the meeting, and no one actually owns it,
Raises the
like you were
hand, yeah.
saying, Harsha.
yes.
Cool.
I know
So
we are on time, so let's take a few questions and then go from there.
we got three. Dave, let's go to Dave. Dave, thank you so much for the comments in the chat. I think the team has relayed them to everyone in case
Right.
the others were not able to see them. He does have a question. He's saying impact of AI on ROI. What are the unknown risks? Examples: AI agents will likely become a significant attack vector for APIs. Rolf Wiggins, the AI looping will result in unintentional API DDoS attacks. I definitely agree with that. I can tell you that, you know, the amount of I think we have that statistic in the anatomy of an API report. I think over 50% of APIs do not have any form of authentication, which means that basically they are very open to DDoSing. They don't have any form of I think over 70% of them do not use rate limiting on their APIs, which again leaves you very, very vulnerable to all of these different types of attacks. And this is one of the, I'm going to let everybody else pitch in, but one of the scariest things about AI, in my opinion, when it comes to onboarding and onto enterprise, into really large orgs, is that unlike most of the other attacks and most of the other software and most of the other attack vectors, you are inviting AI. You're letting it in, right? So you're purposefully saying, "Hey, we're going to be using this. We're going to let it loose on our APIs, and hope it goes well." I don't think you should hope. I think you should have absolute visibility into what's going on, not just because not that I think AI is bad. I just think it's not perfect, and when you need to be aware of what happened, when and how. So I think visibility is going to be key going forward and a huge part of the API governance effort. What do you guys think?
I mean, and like you said, very rightly so, it's unintentional attack vector. An agent trying to maybe complete a task that you asked it to do can call the same endpoint, slightly adjusting different parameters or metadata, trying for failures. So you're inviting this new class of risk for yourself. and that traffic can look identical to a very denial of a service attack maybe. So we really, there's no hacker involved, there's no outage involved, so it's just automated
It's
looping
automation.
and
Yeah.
persistence.
I
So
mean, it points to why API governance is so crucial for
Yeah,
the AI era. Like, so you've got because then you're addressing things like that large number of unauthorized or unauthenticated APIs. Get those sorts of things right. But then also it brings in an organizational knowledge so that when you're starting to look at MCP servers, someone is saying, shouldn't we have the same authentication on that we have over here? Or, what's the authentication, model that we're using and all of that sort of thing. So there's that. Then the metrics that I'm showing and how to do this ROI or how to show the loss, that becomes part of what's needed in AI, because you need to map out your FinOps. Because if it does go through that looping, not only is the DOS attacker risk, but the amount you're now spending on tokens just being spent, also goes through the roof. So you need to be able to cut those sorts of things off as well, and so having this business first mindset coming in to how you consider your architecture helps you think through some of those FinOps
agreed.
risks. Yeah.
So
Agreed.
essentially, your APIs should be more intelligent to defend themselves
Right.
against these
I'd
Or
say you
you
more
should
should be
have
more
intelligent,
more
intelligent.
insights
more
other
intelligent.
than the load time, which is what everybody seems to be focusing on.
Right.
Um, we've got two more. How does API governance maturity influence readiness for AI use cases, particularly around secure data exposure and model integration? I think we've kind of
Just
covered
done
that
that.
one, which is very, very close. I think besides the security aspects and visibility that we've talked about when it comes to AI, I think documentation is going to become very important. But unlike before, where you could potentially get away with having, wrongly defined models in your documentation, AI doesn't care, right? They cannot, they're not at that level where they can intelligently think like a human being and say, oh, this guy probably meant that, right? They're just going to take it at face value. If something is returned, that's what they're going to use. If something isn't returned, they're going to assume that, they failed at that task and they cannot do it. So I think besides the things that we mentioned, documentation is going to be very important.
Mm.
And how does API governance maturity translate into a competitive advantage?
I think governance is both a flywheel and a moat.
You have all the fancy terms today. Nice.
Yeah, I've been working on that one for a little while. Yeah, because it's going to speed up your competitive advantage, because you're going to be able to scale faster and bring and onboard partners faster. And also the quality, it comes back to what you were saying at the beginning, Vedran, about trust. Like,
Yep.
if you're working with partners, if you're working with customers, they're going to trust your APIs and your digital integrations more, because they are
Exactly.
robust. They've got the authentication, they've got the security, the compliance, the standardization, interoperability, all of those things. Yeah, I'm trying to make that a thing.
I
Just
agree. I
just adding
mean,
one more thing to the ecosystem that Mark said. Partners, developers, third parties, everyone, and also your AI agents who are now also part of the ecosystem
Right.
that will consume your APIs. So, as long as your APIs are predictable, people can integrate faster, AI can integrate faster, and you can make more money out of them.
agreed. Agreed. Cool. I know we're a bit overboard. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us. It was really an interesting one. All the materials, like we said, will be shared with you, including some of the stuff that Mark is doing and all those calculations, the decks, our report, everything. Mattia and Bruno from our team are gonna package that up and figure out a way to send it to you. And we'll see you on the next one. Again, we do have these once a month. So far, towards the end of the month, is what we call an industry webinar. And then we were supposed to start this month with like our product webinars, but didn't. So I hope we'll start next month, and let's see how that goes. Okay. Thank
for
you
the
both,
invitation.
gentlemen, and thank you everybody else. I really appreciate it. Bye bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Mark, as always. Take care.
Cheers.
Thanks for